Hey guys, how's it going? Jason Station here, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be going over the changes that are coming to this week's balance patch. If you guys are still getting caught up to date with how the new card balance patch cadence works, we're going to have, so we just had the new expansion, we're going to have a balanced patch, and then we're going to have a variety expansion, a balance patch, and then new cards again. So right now we're in between new cards and more new cards with a little bit of a balance change. And I do think it's coming in at a pretty good timing because I think the meta has definitely slowed down a lot, stabilized. You don't really see many new decks roaming around now that a lot of the brewing and the changes from the open have already passed, and people are just not really trying out too many new things currently. And I think this is pretty nice because I think there's pretty much 4 decks that we've seen in the past couple of weeks pretty much stay at the top of the ladder, being the Ashe LeBlanc, the Set Karma, your Samira decks, as well as the Jack Seraphine deck. So I want to review these changes, and hopefully they have a decent sizable impact across the meta coming this week. Now, this is a little bit early, but there was an official Legends of Runeterra stream where they talk about the balance patch. So even though the patch notes themselves aren't out yet, and I will link them down below in the description if you guys are interested in that once it goes live, but these changes are confirmed and will be going live this Wednesday. Starting off, we have both Ashe and Reckoning. Nice typo there. But these are obvious targeted changes towards the Ashe LeBlanc deck. Now Ashe itself is going from frostbiting 4 enemies to 5 enemies for her level up condition, and Reckoning is going from 6 to 7 mana. Now I don't think the Ashe change is particularly necessary. It definitely makes her weaker because she's harder to level up, but I don't think the Ashe LeBlanc deck really fully utilize Ashe as the main level of win con, at least not anymore or in recent iterations of the deck, or at least even in the meta, right? It was a lot more about just developing very big units on board and just beating your opponent down and eventually rallying, right? Ashe was definitely a little bit more of a side win condition where if you really needed it, or if you're just really snowballing your advantage, Ashe is there to help you out, right? So I really don't see this Ashe change being very impactful. Now, what this could not do is, let's say the meta shifts away from things that die to Reckoning, for example, into more of the mid-range stuff, right? Things that are a little bit beefier and more mid-range decks that historically Ashe decks are pretty good into. You know, Ashe will be a slightly worse component against those kind of matchups, but again, it should still be super favorable for Ashe decks regardless. So really, I didn't really expect the Ashe to be one of the targets of the change. But I guess it does weaken it to some extent. Now, Reckoning going from 6 to 7 mana is definitely something that hits it a lot harder, and you know, for any sort of card, especially when it gets to these higher mana costs that get a little bit extra of a mana cost. You know, we've seen things like Back Alley Bar from played in pretty much every deck to played in very fringe cases, maybe even cut from decks, right? And I think a similar thing can be said about Reckoning. Now, Reckoning is still one of these cards that is super just meta dependent. You're still going to be playing this card if it completely like just flips a matchup on its head, but it definitely is a little bit trickier to hold up 7 mana comparative to 6, right? Especially with these Ashe decks being so reliant on being able to develop out their board in order to just really pressure you, then having less mana to use on units compared to holding up to save on Reckoning, for example, can be pretty detrimental to maybe its curve, maybe its game plan, and maybe how reliably or consistently can cast out Reckoning without either falling super far behind or being able to pressure your opponent after the Reckoning is cast. So I think these changes will affect the deck. It's hard to say. I think Ashe itself, even in matchups where Reckoning wasn't really a big factor, can still be very strong in ways outside of both Ashe and Reckoning. I do think these 2 changes are relatively soft changes, and I'm not sure, honestly. I don't think it's the biggest of deals, in my opinion, and so I still think Ashe LeBlanc is still going to be quite a prevalently powerful deck, assuming that the meta stays in a relatively consistent place after the expansion, or sorry, after the balance patch. Now, that's not a guarantee, but hypothetically, if everything remained the same, I still think Ashe LeBlanc is still going to be a very powerful deck. Now the next few changes here are towards the Samira Fizz deck. We see All Out, Wiggly Burblefish, as well as Inferna seeing a couple of changes. All Out going from a +2/+2 to a +2/+1. Wiggly Burblefish going from 6 mana to 8 mana, and Inferna going from a 1/5 to a 1/4. Let's start with All Out, because that's probably one of the most impactful cards within the Samira Fizz deck. Going from +2 to +1 in health is, generally speaking, a pretty big deal overall. One aspect of All Out that's still very powerful is the fact that it still just gives 2 attack, especially with things like Samira that already has quick attack. That's, generally speaking, not that big of a deal, right? But what makes it a really big deal is using it defensively. If you want to buff up your Samira against your opponents, having that +1 versus +2 can be very, very detrimental, especially if you're trying to stack multiple All Outs. You're going to see diminishing effects, right? Where now 2 All Outs only gives you the same health as 1, and that can mean that your Samira is a lot more vulnerable during your opponent's turn. Now, we have been seeing a shift away from specifically Samira Fizz in recent this week. We've been seeing more of the Samira Varus, Samira Leona, and in those decks, All Out really isn't all that much of an X factor. It's a nice buff, but you already have things like Pale Cascade. You have things like Momentous Choice in their respective decks, and we've been seeing a little bit of a shift away from All Out, and that's to say that even if Samira Fizz is really impacted by these changes, there's still going to be a very, very powerful Samira deck that doesn't care about All Out, that doesn't care about Inferna, that doesn't care about Wiggly Burblefish, right? Now, I will say that the changes to Wiggly Burblefish in particular is probably the hardest of these 3. A lot of times, if you have Inferno on turn 4 and you're drawing these fleeting cards, reasonably by turn 5, turn 6, you're able to get a 0-cost Burblefish down. But now if that Burblefish is fleeting, costs 2, and you can't play it, that can be a little bit of a liability. And especially in earlier games or in matchups where, you're very limited on spells, maybe you don't have that stylish shot, it can be pretty difficult to get out these Burblefishers, which means you're going to have slower mid games, slower Shelly turns, and slower go wide turns, which is definitely very impactful for the deck, right? So overall, I think Wiggly Burblefish's change is the most impactful towards the Fizz Samira archetype. Inferno going from 1/5 to 1/4 is reasonable. Now, there's not really many things in the meta that specifically deal 4 damage that don't deal 5 damage. Things that come to mind are like the Shooting Star, maybe the new Tarragon card, but there's really fringe removal options that deal 4 damage in the game right now. There's no Flock, there's no Black Spear. A lot of things deal 3 damage, a lot of things deal 2 damage. Some things like Soul Harvest already just kill Inferno straight up. It's not like Inferno is now susceptible to Quietus, right? Yeah, Inferno can't block as easily, but 4 health is still quite a beefy stat line in most situations, to at least block once and get away with it, right? So it's an expected change. Inferno is definitely one of the stronger cards, but a relatively, I think, less impactful change overall. Again, no real changes to Samira outside of All Out, because All Out is her champion spell, but the implications of not changing Samira means that Samira Fizz just won't be the most popular, or I don't even know if it's currently the most popular Samira deck out there anymore. But you're going to see a decline in Samira Fizz, but those Samira players are just going to be playing a different Samira deck, right? Samira is powerful not just because she has this really strong combo deck with Fizz and Bilgewater, right? We've already been seeing, again, the Samira Leona, and now the Samira Varus, and even I'm sure there can be many, many other really strong Samira decks out there. So as much as I will say that these changes do affect specifically the Samira Fizz deck, I really don't think that's the problem of what really is out there, and it's more targeted towards Samira being, the core of why Samira Fizz was such a prevalent issue or predominant factor in today's meta, right? But overall, I mean, these changes are fine if you're targeting specifically the deck, but again, I think Samira overall is a little bit of a hit and miss there. So that's a little bit unfortunate. Still very interested to see how that pans out. Next up, we have Leona and Sun Guardian. I think ever since the rework towards the Daybreak package, especially towards Sun Guardian in particular, you know, these Daybreak cards have seen some very, very dominant power and play and power levels, especially things like Katarina Leona, and now we're seeing Samira Leona. And I do think that these changes are definitely a lot more impactful in the relative terms. Leona at Daybreak 4 to Daybreak 5 in order for the level up. It's really when Leona levels up that becomes that engine that really close out games, right? And this could mean that Leona levels 1 turn later or 2 turns later, and or I mean maybe 1 turn later, but that might give you an additional 2 turns because, well, maybe she levels up on your attack turn or she couldn't level on their attack turn, right? So I think this is very impactful in slowing down the aggression that Leona decks can bring. Now, I think Daybreak overall, even without Leona, can still be a very powerful swarm deck. You've seen like Twilight Protector really be that keystone in being able to buff up early boards to really apply a lot of pressure. We still have cards like Crimson Pigeon that synergize well with the Solari Shield Bearer still, that can create really wide boards early on, even before Leona, right? You can get a 6 wide board on turns 3, turns 4, and you're gonna beat down your opponent even before Leona comes down. But in a lot of situations where you're dropping Leona on turn 5 and then leveling her before your next attack turn, you know, this is going to slow down that level of aggression that can really shut down your opponent and feel like you can't really do much to stop this kind of attack, right? Now, Sun Guardian going from a 2/3 to a 2/2. So on play, it's a 3-mana 3/3 and it scales that way. Obviously, taking away health points like that is definitely very impactful. We have a good amount of 3-mana 3/4s. No, that's not true, but we have a lot of 3 attack 3 drops, right? It's a lot harder to get away with just developing Sun Guardian on turn 3, getting a value attack out of it on the turn you play it, and then continue to scale it onwards, right? So on that 1 turn, you know, you get to slow down that really powerful 3-mana 3/4 coming down when you have maybe your 3-mana 3/2 or your 3-mana 3/3, right? So having that little bit of health definitely goes a long way in, again, slowing down this deck at some really critical points, right? When you have that 3/4 come down on 3, it feels really powerful when you know you can't block it, and then it scales even further, right? I think these are very good changes. But again, right, I still think that Samira Leona is going to be a pretty strong deck, and even if that's not the case, we still have Samira Varus, which largely has remained untouched. Now we have a few changes to Karma PNZ or Karma set, specifically within the PNZ folder. Outside of Karma, we have changes to both Caustic Rift as well as Drum Solo. Starting with Karma losing a point of health, going from a 5-mana 4/4 to a 5-mana 4/3. And I will say that this change really isn't all that impactful. Yes, if you play Karma early on or before turn or before you have 10 mana crystals, Karma dies a little bit easier, right? But a lot of the cases, the Karma set deck just never really cared about being able to play Karma out early, right? Never really cared about needing that random spell. For the most part, obvious cases, you know, in some games you're not going to have a hand that has draw or things to do. You're going to want to drop Karma. Maybe you need a block. Maybe you just need some extra value. Of course, now having only 3 health, you really can't block anything, so Karma essentially is a little bit of a dud against some more unit-based matchups if you don't have a good hand. But in the long term, you know, not much of a change, not an impact to Karma set as the deck overall. Caustic Rift going from 3 mana to 4 mana, but still remaining 2 mana after or when you have activated Flow. The effect is still the same. This is all right. It's a little bit, it's not a huge change, right? Because if you proc Flow, it's still going to cost 2 at the end of the day, regardless of its mana increase from the nerf. I will say that Karma deck specifically has a little bit of a hard time proccing Flow, and in like the Jack Seraphine deck, it has a lot easier time of proccing Flow. So realistically, Caustic Rift is still pretty much the same card. Now, I don't really know if Caustic Rift was, you know, the biggest problem It's only really powerful in conjunction with the mischievous Mirai, right? Now you do have to be a little bit more careful planning out your mana because, well, now if you don't flow Caustic Rift on turn 5, you can't play Mischievous Mirai plus Caustic Rift, right? So there is some planning that has to be a little bit careful there, but again, overall, I think Caustic Rift change, not super impactful. Drum Solo, draw 2, same card, except the mana reduction is only by 1 instead of 2. I do agree that Drum Solo itself was probably a particularly strong card. When you have things like just mana cheat onto just semi-random cards, it can be very powerful, just either hiding information in your hand, having 0 mana spells that can sort of play out, having a 3 mana Karma, for example, things that can really just throw your opponent off, and inherently just, you know, very powerful, right? I could see this being a nice change, but, you know, again, I think relatively tame sort of changes. This doesn't really change how Karma Set works, right? It didn't really change how Samira works. It didn't really change how was there another deck? No, so far, right? Like fundamental, or like Ash LeBlanc, right? So far these decks haven't fundamentally been changed in any way. You just see a little bit of a, you know, a little tap on the wrist. And it'll be interesting to see how impactful these changes are going to be in the long term as we get the patch. And as for the last 2 points of nerfs, we have a nerf to opulent foyer. When I'm summoned, summon in Ghastly Band. Round start, if you have the attack token, summon a Ghastly Band. So the only change here is that you can only summon a Ghastly Band outside of the initial summon on round start. What that means is you cannot rally to get a Ghastly Band. So when you cast things like Relentless Pursuit, you're not going to generate a Ghastly Band. When you scout attack, you're not going to generate a Ghastly Band. And this is, I think, quite relevant, honestly. I think so far, if we're talking about just relative changes, this is probably the single most impactful change to any card that is getting nerfed. And I think also has one of the highest consequences towards the deck that it particularly fitted in, being the Gwen Quinn or Gwen Demacia variants, right? And for that deck in particular, that honestly probably wasn't even super good. It's a little bit tough to see one of its best cards get, I would say, kind of gutted. I think you still probably play this card. It's still really good for the archetype, but definitely nowhere near the power level that it once had. But I still think it's a healthy change overall for the card, because a card like this just has a really powerful effect that definitely needs to be in check. And Ambitious Cultist, the spell that you generate only costs 0 for the round, which is, you know, it's like, sure, right? It's in tune with things like the Sputtering Song Spinner, right? The same sort of effects where you generate a card that costs 0 for the turn, but after that turn it costs 2, right? And I think that's fine, right? But again, really just not a huge nerf overall. And I do think that, you know, maybe they're not really focused on hitting these decks with really big nerfs, and really more hoping either things kind of, or maybe they hope that it's impactful enough, or they're just banking on the newer cards to have a bigger effect, not make any major changes before they release newer cards. I could also see that, given that, you know, they probably planned out the newer cards long before they planned out this patch note, right? So it might be, you know, it's hard to say what the reasoning is for not putting more impactful changes and really shifting up things yet. But so far I will say that, and these are the last cards that are getting nerfed, will jump into buffs. But again, these nerfs just aren't really, they're not ground shaking, right? They're not going to change the top decks, what they do. They don't break them. They don't force you to play something new, right? And there's goods and bads to that, but I really do wish that there were some more impactful changes to some of these decks. Now, for some of the buffs, I do think there are some really interesting buffs that could enable or inspire experimentation. And I think there are some interesting buffs, starting with these ones. Specifically for some Nightfall archetype cards that Nightfall has lost a lot of its cards. And now we're putting more focus of Nightfall into the Targon region. Starting with Cygnus. Cygnus is going from a 6 mana 5/3 to a 5 mana 3/3 with the same text, except Cygnus himself has elusive. I'll cover Clovenway as well before we talk about it. But Clovenway going from a 5 mana 5/4 to a 4 mana 4/3. I think these changes are actually pretty cool. Because one thing that you do have to keep in mind with Nightfall cards overall is that their mana cost is probably slightly less than their true mana cost, right? And what I mean by that is because we have the Lunari Dustbringer that generates the dust that can essentially discount your Nightfall cards by 1 for the turn, means that you could be playing Clovenway on turn 3, right? You could be playing a 3 mana 4/3 Overwhelm that stuns a unit for 2 turns. You could be playing Cygnus for 4 mana, right? And that's something very important to keep note of, because I do think that these have some, generally speaking, pretty powerful effects. It's essentially Arachnoid Sentry, but kind of doubled up, right? And Cygnus, especially in conjunction with Diana, is a relatively okay game ender. Now, Nightfall itself has lost some core tools like Stygian Onlooker, as well as Dark Doombeast. So it's hard to say what the archetype's gonna look like with these changes, but I want to give credit to especially Clovenway. I think this card looks actually really good, and again, especially because of Lunari Dustbringer allowing you to play it at a slightly discounted cost. Now, Moondreamer is the outlier here. It's going from a 5 mana 3/6 to Invoke to having a Nightfall effect that reduces the card's cost by 1, which honestly isn't that bad if the Invoke archetype itself wasn't where it's at, right? I think Clovenway and Cygnus are good nods towards this more aggressive / mid-range Nightfall archetype, whereas Moondreamer, despite having the Nightfall keyword, is definitely more of an Invoke card than anything else, right? And we haven't seen cards like Star Shaping really see all that much play, or these big Invoke archetypes. So it's hard to say what Moondreamer is doing. It's a little bit of a weird outlier, but I wanna give some credit towards any Diana stands out there, because I think these changes are going to be pretty okay. So quite excited for these two. Next up, we have some more some smaller changes here. We have Mirror Image, Bandle Gunners, as well as Advanced Intel. Mirror Image is the spell that leveled up LeBlanc crates, and it says summon an exact ephemeral copy of an ally with +5 power. Now what they have done with it is they've removed the 5+ power requirement, so now you can copy essentially any ally you want, right? Which is cool, which is really cool, right? You can copy Teemo, you can double a level Teemo, right? But this is also a pretty sizable buff for the Ashe LeBlanc deck. And even though on stream, I know they said that they think that this buff doesn't, you know, outweigh the nerfs to Ashe and Reckoning, but I really don't know if that's true. Being able to summon a Trifarian Assessor when it's a 4/3, being able to summon the Rally guy even if he's frozen, even if he's just like has his attack reduced, it's a lot less interaction, right? It always feels tough where, you know, you want to make this change for flavor, for playability, for, you know, for making LeBlanc feel good, but you're also while this isn't a direct impact to what, you know, interaction, it always feels weird or feels bad to have interaction removed, right? Like in the past, if you say your LeBlanc player plays mirror image and you freeze your opponent's card, all of a sudden mirror image like fizzles, right? And losing just even the slightest bits of interaction always feels bad. I think it's a healthy change overall to LeBlanc. It's cool, it's flavorful, it's really nice to have, and it has a lot of really cool, I guess, synergies now that the requirement has been lifted. But I fear that, you know, this change really does just take Ashe LeBlanc a little bit over the edge, where I think the nerfs were maybe not very impactful at all. Vandal Gunners is an interesting card. Old text was an 8 mana 7/7 spell shield that says when I'm summoned, if you've summoned units from 4+ regions, grant me 4 impact. Now it's going to be a little bit more like things like Scuttlegeist and Plaza Guardian, even things like Arbiter of the Peak, where it has a 10 mana cost and it's a 5/5, but now its cost scales down based on how many multi-region allies you've summoned this game. And now it only has 3 impact, right? Which I think is actually really cool, because I think we've been seeing some Bandle Swarm decks. I've been seeing like Samira Bandle City playing like the Owlcats, right? Playing the Carved Blade Twirler, and just focusing on either just going wide with the Augment, the multi-region followers, things like Grandfather Fae. And this card could honestly be quite okay, right? I will say playing 10 multi-region, you know, allies is a lot more difficult than something like play 10 spells. But even if you get this down for 5 mana, it's 5 mana, 5/5 spell shield, 3 impact good. I mean, it's pretty okay, right? Unfortunately, it's going to be a slightly dead card in the early game if you know, draw it. But I do think that this might enable a decent sort of Bandle City Swarm deck that isn't reminiscent of things like Yordle and Arms in the past, right? Instead, it has a little bit more of a board-based payoff in Vandal Gunners, which I think is actually healthy as far as how you want to design archetypes. So I'm curious about this. I do like its design. It's not something like Yordle and Arms as a finisher, but just something more of a potential cheap late game bomb that you can drop and catch your opponents off guard. So quite happy about that. Advanced Intel, going from my 1 mana card to 2 mana card, but now it also draws 1 card, right? So it's something like Pale Cascade for Flash Bomb decks. Is that better? I mean, draw is fantastic, right? I just think that there's probably better cards to put in this card slot. But I mean, this card is infinitely better than it once was, right? He also can't generate off of Wiggly Burblefish anymore, so whether or not that's a buff or a nerf, but it is better. It's hard to say if it's playable now, but this is a good change. I don't really have many opinions of that one. And then the last 2 cards here, we have Retired Reckoner and Deathless Knight. 2 cards that haven't really seen play, but again, that's also one of the things that they wanted to sort of do with these patches, right? Retired Reckoner is a 5 mana 2/6 with Overwhelming Noxus that reads, when you target me, grant me +1/+0, and they're giving Retired Reckoner an additional point of attack. So essentially, he is slightly bigger when he comes down, so he can either trade better or just help you set up for slightly more over the top. Is this card good? I don't know. It's hard to say. Well, something I've heard people say is just within like the Samira Varus deck, this could be a additional sort of Varus. It is very reminiscent of Varus, where it has Overwhelm, it scales with targets. So it looks very similar to Varus. It obviously has an extra additional point of health, which is nice. It's hard to say if you actually want to play followers like this, but it could be okay. So it'd be interesting to see if this change really pushes it over the top. Outside of specifically Samira Varus, will this really see all that much play? It's a little bit hard to say, but what I want again, like when I see changes like this, I like it because it gives people a reason to experiment with cards like these, right? So whether or not something comes out of it is up to, you know, the community and to really figure out if this belongs. But okay, it's cool. Deathless Knight, 6 mana to 5 mana. For those of you who don't know what this is, it's a 6 mana 5/5 fearsome in Shadow Isles that reads, when I would gain ephemeral, grant me +1/+1 instead. And now you can play it a turn earlier. So, oh, but you know what's actually kind of cool about this is what I'm thinking about now is they just released Soul Cleave, right? So when you Soul Cleave Deathless Knight and you create 2 Deathless Knights, not only are they not going to be ephemeral because this card can't gain ephemeral, they'd also be 6/6s, right? Just cute. It's hilarious. So I can see some like cheese opportunities there. I'm not sure if the card, the outlicker card, the Shadow Isles 1-drop that gives a unit ephemeral and discounts it by 1 is still in the game. I mean, it's still in standard. If it is, you know, that is pretty good with this. Maybe get Death Knight out even earlier out. But I don't know how strong Deathless Knight is, especially in like things like Ash LeBlanc, right? But again, experimentation always good. I think that was all the buffs as well. Did I miss some? Oh no, I missed a lot. Jeez. Okay, this is gonna be a long video. Buff to Azir, Nasus, and Glory's Call. So Azir is going from summon 13 allies to level up to 12 allies. Nasus is going from a 2 mana or a 2/2 to a 3/3. So essentially, they're slightly easier to level, right? Which, in what decks does that matter? Mono Shrima, exactly. Nasus really hasn't really seen much play recently outside of, even in Mono Shrima, but even outside of Mono Shrima. I understand the change in Nasus, and Azir, I suppose, is fine. But it feels a little bit strange that the only archetype they want to push in Shrima is this Mono Shrima archetype. Feels a little bit bland to me, although even if Shrima itself is, I guess that's half of its region's identity. It's not a huge fan of just touching specifically like this stuff. I really wish that they could give other things a little bit more of a look at, but you know, it's fine. Glorious Call, going from 6 mana to 5 mana. For those of you who are unfamiliar, this costs 2 less for every different Ascended ally you've played this game. Oh, it's only played? I thought it was leveled. Okay, that's okay. This card's slightly better, I guess. But it manifests a card from the Emperor's deck that costs 9 or less, which is essentially every card, with the exception of Ascended's Rise, or whatever the card's called. The one that summons level 3 Renekton and Nasus. This card's never seen play, but I mean, I don't think this card is like terrible. It costs 3 when you've played Azir, and it costs 1 if you played 2 champs. It could be okay. You never want to play for 5 though, unfortunately. Do you want to play for 3? And what kind of deck do you like? Yeah. Like the only possible deck that could play it is some sort of value, slow, control-y Shrima deck. Outside of Mono Shrima, there really doesn't exist this kind of archetype, especially given that Xerath has been rotated. And I know a lot of these cards have implications within the Eternal format, but I'm really just focusing on their implications in Standard. And I really don't see this being overall impactful. Again, it's really cool to see changes like this, but I'll be curious to see if anyone actually picks this up. This change, however, I think is potentially really powerful. They're changing Targonian Telestones finally. Right now, Telestones creates Wish, Paddlestar, and Blessing of Targon, and now they're changing it to Behold the Infinite, Hush, and Blessing of Targon, which are 3 insane cards, right? They're not insane. I mean, they're insane because they all have different uses, right? You have a value card, you have an interaction card, and you have a buff card. So 3 inherent distinct uses that don't overlap with each other in one card. which gives you inherently insane flexibility with a card like this, right? Outside of maybe like Samira Leona, I could see most even just slightly slower target on X1 or play this card. Having the ability to just either go late with Behold the Infinite, surprise opponent with Blessing of Targon, or even Hush, I think is super impactful, especially for the only additional 1 mana cost. I think Targonian Telestones is one of the biggest winners of this patch as far as buffs go. So it'd be exciting to see what Targon decks actually want to pick this up. But super happy with this change. I love when Telestones are actually impactful. This is potential on the level of like old Ionian Telestones. Now obviously Ionia has better ways of utilizing old Ionian Telestones, but I think on a comparative level, which is really good to see. And last 3 buffs here, we have Soul Harvest, going from killing a champion with 3 or less power from 4 mana to only 3 mana, which is nice. It's like slow speed culling strike, but it's cheaper to kill followers, right? Cool change. I think Soul Harvest has good hits already. It kills things like Eternal Dancers, it kills things like Mischievous Mirai, and whatever champions it kills out there, it already kills. And the upside now is that when your opponent plays like all out on their Samir to save it, you're spending 1 less mana, so it feels less bad to cast on a champion, especially when champions are usually higher prio targets. Have it fizzled, it's not as bad. Hadrigan the Infernal, the 9 mana 9/6 dragon, goes from when I'm summoned, grant other dragon allies ever +2/+2 to +4/+4. Grants other dragons, so it doesn't grant itself, right? Could be okay. It reminds me of what's it called, Champion Strength, right? Where say you have dragons on board and they get buffed +4/+4, you're essentially casting Champion Strength, but you're not having like the upside of Scout Attack or Rally, right? The only upside is if you don't have a board, which makes this card really awkward to play if you don't have a board, right? You're just playing a 9 mana unit, which is kind of illegal nowadays. The change is cool. It gives power to the player, right? You feel great when you slam this card down and all of a sudden your dragons go kaboom. But it doesn't really change, you know, are people gonna play this card or not, unfortunately. And last change here, Priestess of Desert Light. So round start, deal 4 to me, draw a champion, or if your deck started with 6+ different champions summon instead. Now, instead of just drawing it, you're granting a +2/+2. This card is so bizarre to me. It doesn't even grant it when you summon it. Like if you're playing it just to draw a champion, so you're not using deck building costs of 6+ champions, and maybe it does, and it's just not worded correctly or misexplained. Maybe it still grants +2/+2 when it's summoned, but for now I don't actually know. If it's just on draw, that feels so weird because you have the Allegiance card still in the game that does the same thing, right? And would you want to play the non-Allegiance version for 6 mana? No. Would you want to deck build your costs around this card still? Probably not. Still very awkward card. I don't know. Some of these buffs are a little bit of a miss for me. And then lastly, we have adjustment to Prank. They're making Prank slightly different, where they're changing some of the options from Prank. So they're removing the -2 attack on Prank or on units. They're reducing the cost increase on units, landmarks, equipments from +2 to +1, but they're making the -1/-0 and vulnerable to -2 and -0 and vulnerable. Oh, I see. So they're making it better against units to interact with, but not to be more expensive. And spells, you still have +2, right? Spells, that's the only thing that can get hit. I mean, overall, I think this is fine. It's hard to say which one is slightly more toxic. I think definitely hitting 2 costs on a unit is insanely toxic, but now guarantee if it's like -2 and vulnerable over -2 attack. That's insane, right? Because beforehand you had 3 options for units. You had -2 attack, -1, -1 vulnerable, and +1 cost, right? Now you're guaranteed -2, -1 vulnerable or +1 cost, which means that it essentially got better if you're like attacking, but worse if you're stalling, right? It's an interesting change, actually. I like the direction of it a lot. I think that +2 cost was hugely detrimental, and even the spells, I think it's quite large. But I like the direction of this. It's a little bit weird that it comes out of the left corner, the left field. But I mean, it's hard to say, right? Overall, I think the nerfs are slightly undertuned. I think the buffs are nice, specifically to Targon. But outside of Targon, it's... I don't know, man. It's hard to say. Hopefully these changes... Hopefully I'm wrong, and these changes have slightly more of an impact. I'm excited to try out this Cloven Way thing, and maybe Cygnus. So I think there's some fun stuff for me, and like Targon Telson seems really cool, but everything else seems a little bit to a lesser extent. I really wish that they were able to hit some of these slightly harder, but that's gonna be it for the patch notes. Sorry this was so long. I didn't expect it to take so long. Oh man, well, I appreciate y'all for hanging out. Hope you guys have a relaxing Tuesday. Oh, there's going to be the first episode of Runeterra Jeopardy out on this channel later this week. Can't figure out what's going on Tuesday or Saturday, but either way, hope you guys are excited for that, so look out for that as well. Again, appreciate y'all for hanging out. I'll see you guys later. Peace out. Have a good day.